is where the Bible talks about tithing. When you go to Malachi chapter 3 and talks about the tithes, and if you don't bring the tithe, I'll release the devourer will come and devour, blah, blah, blah. But if you give your tithe, I will open the windows of heaven and pour out to you a blessing and all those things. So then if you don't tithe, your pocket will be tight. If you don't tithe, the devourer will come for your money. If you don't, you see, understand that this was under the Old Testament contract. I was teaching some of the brethren. I told them that tithing is not Old Testament. I've taught you this about 4 years ago. Tithing is not Old Testament. Tithing came before the law. The Old Testament did not start in the book of Genesis. The Old Testament started in the book of Exodus chapter 19. The New Testament did not start from the book of Matthew. It started in the book of Acts chapter 2. So don't just look at the arrangement of the books and say, of course, just for easy reference, and we divided into two, Old Testament and New Testament. But when you go into it, you can really tell, when did the contract begin? When did the testament begin? That is where it starts. So if you just look at it superficially and say that because it was in the Old Testament, or Abraham paid tithe before the Old Testament. Abraham did not live under the Old Testament. He didn't. He didn't live under the Old Testament. He lived before the law. He lived before Moses. And so he was the first person to give a tithe. And normally there's something we call the law of first mention. When you talk about the law of first mention, most of the times that is where you get the definition of that concept. Or you get the true concept of that thing that is being spoken about. So if you really want to understand the origin of tithe, and study Abraham and see how he gave the tithe. He was not coerced to give the tithe. And some people get it wrong that, in the New Testament, it doesn't have to be 10% anymore. It can be any percent. That's not true. Tithe means 10. Tithe means a tenth. So you cannot say your tithe can be 40%. No. And most of the time, some people are saying that they actually don't even give up to 10. They give below. They are just trying to let you know that now you are not bound by 10. But truly, Abraham was not bound by 10. He gave a tenth by the revelation he had experienced. And that tenth is what is called the tithe. He had gone for war. He had spoiled the enemy. Everything he won, he came and then he met Melchizedek, who gave him bread and wine, which is a shadow of the communion, the death and resurrection of Jesus. He was awakened to the righteousness of God. And the Bible says, after all that, then Abraham gave a tenth of all. He was not given a tenth because he was to be blessed. He actually gave the tenth because he had come with the spoil. He had come with a victory. So your tithing is a testimony of what God has blessed you, not you giving for God to bless you. That is not what the Bible teaches.